CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I welcome Jim Pfaff, the new president of the Conservative Caucus, 50 years old within an hours. And the Conservative Caucus is now devoting itself to political affairs. However, there's one affair that Jim and I can agree doesn't have a party attached to it, and that's national defense. The Roman way of putting this is, if you want peace, prepare for war. Jim, congratulations, your new presidency and 50 years of the Conservative Caucus, and that's a fair beginning. You're a veteran of Washington. You know the Hill. You know how radio works. You've been on the air in America. So all of these things come together to repeat again and again. We do not have the industrial base necessary in order to defend ourselves from our near-peer adversaries, Russia and China combined. And what's ahead of us is to convince the Congress and the American people it represents that we must rebuild the industrial base, the Navy yards, the training of personnel to do the simple welding necessary for the fleet. I'm also thinking of the Air Force. You have all these things, Jim. What is your thinking about what needs to be done, what the Conservative Caucus can do? Good evening to you, Jim.
Thank you very much. Well, what we try to do is, as a caucus perspective, is try to make sure that we are getting grassroots activists involved to get the kinds of people who will take these sorts of things seriously elected into Congress. And certainly we work in the local level with certain organizations in the states. But in terms of what the United States can do, we really do need to put an emphasis back on some key industrial things that will allow us to be successful with this potential threats that are emerging. I mean, in the next 5 to 10 years, even, we could see major threats. One of those things is we need to get back to shipbuilding. I spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill with connecting with people in Taiwan. I have a friend on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there, and I went to Taiwan. One of the things that they would like to have, they always wanted to have, was for us to approve the purchase of submarines, so that, and not the top technology that's there now, just something that they could use. So as I was having that discussion, you find out we're woefully inadequate in our submarine building capability, our shipbuilding capability as well. We need to be able to encourage that. I think we need to have a very strong defense. The second thing is, though, the general capacity for construction of anything. And one of the things that Donald Trump has talked a lot about, I know this has been a point of discussion even as far back as the Clinton administration, frankly, where our industrial base has been waning. I think this issue with U.S. Steel is really important in that regard right now, because if we lose that aspect of our industrial base, we're not going to be able to fill out the rest of the needs that we have to make our military strong. But we have got to rebuild that industrial base. It's a serious national security threat.
The Republican Party especially, over the course of the Cold War, was always emphasizing national defense. Has something gone wrong with the party that they've lost the track, Jim? I
think what you're seeing is a real frustration with throwing us out into wars that may or may not be necessary. I do have great concern with that, but I think there's a bit of an overreaction, an almost anti-military reaction to it. I tended to take the less government end and keeping out of wars everywhere that we can. But I've never backed off of what I grew up with, the Reagan conservatism that does press this peace through strength understanding. So we have some real work to do to get the Republican Party to understand the need for a strong defense, while at the same time keeping us out of wars and only making those things that are a direct threat to us a priority.
Vietnam, Cambodia, and then coming up to date, Iraq, followed by Afghanistan. These are administrations from many different directions. And yet each time we've come up against a frustration. There's no end to it. You can't call it a victory. You can't call it a defeat. The American people have lost touch with what national security means. How did that happen?
I frankly put a lot of blame on the Clinton and Bush administrations in this regard. Now, I could talk about the Obama administration and others all we want, but we changed our whole idea of what war meant when politicians began to think even more deeply about the fact that if you go to war, you get some sort of political advantage. I think that risk was there in the latter Clinton administration, certainly in the Bush administration. I mean, there was a real desire to respond to 9/11, and I understand that. In fact, I even to this day support that first foray into Afghanistan to retaliate for who we knew the actors were and that they were there. But ongoing, our administrations have had this idea that just being in war is a positive factor for them. And it does play out politically, at least temporarily, in their favor. But that idea has been lost because of the political side of this. The American people, though, pay the price because they've watched this over almost 30 years now. They've watched this decline in understanding the need and purpose for war, and that you have to have a discipline to get out of war. Going into war, whether you decide to do that or not, you have to have a plan for going out of it. We threw that away for the political purposes that I described there.
And the near-peer threats of Beijing and Moscow, are the American people aware of it, or do they regard this as some kind of trade dispute?
I think that Moscow is on their minds right now, obviously, because of what's going on in Ukraine. No matter what people, what side of that issue they fall on, and we're having, obviously, a real dispute about that. But I think that people do not understand what the threat of China is militarily as it relates to Taiwan. And it's not only a military problem, it's also an economic problem. Yeah, I think the number is 80% of all semiconductor manufacturing is done in Taiwan, TSMC being the largest, by far the largest chip manufacturer in the world, based right there. They have some facilities outside of Taiwan, but most of that production's happening there. And so people don't understand what the risk to that is. China does covet Taiwan to this day, ever since Chiang Kai-shek took the KMT over there when they lost to Mao back in the 1950s. So this is a huge issue that I don't think people are paying close enough attention to and recognizing what the very real threat, not only to Taiwan, but to us is if China were to decide to be aggressive.
And if there's one thing you would say to the Republican Party, what would it be to get them motivated on this? Do we need a Pearl Harbor? That's a little extreme, Jim.
I think if we wait for Pearl Harbors, that's horrible. We can get too aggressive and pretend like there's a Pearl Harbor constantly looming. But what we really need is a Republican Party, if Trump comes into the White House, whoever it is, that would reassert in our military the discipline of the skill of military actors rather than the political nature. We politicized the military greatly over the last 20 years. We need to change that way of operating, and we need to start focusing on competence, on the basic doctrines of war that had served us very well all the way up until this last century, and then reform that. I'm personally hopeful that Donald Trump gets elected because I think he has that concept and idea behind him. I don't have as much confidence in Kamala Harris in that regard.
Jim Pfaff is the new president of the Conservative Caucus, just 50 years young.
You're listening to CBS Eye on the World with John Batchelor.